If you were active in the Pokemon community in 2013, not only are you old, but you probably vividly remember the announcement of Pokemon X and Y, the first 3D games in the mainline series. You might even remember that there were a lot of rumors going around about the game, introducing some new Pokemon types. We all now know that this type was Fairy, but there was actually some pretty good consensus around the time that there would be 2 new types, Light and Sound. I remember posts like this one living in my head rent-free. Xerneas was said to be a light type because of the rainbow colors on its antlers, representing the light spectrum, and its radiant reveal in the announcement trailer. Yveltal was then supposed to be sound type, as people thought it looked like a wyvern, a mythical creature known for shrills and shrieks, and it was also the only Pokemon in the reveal trailer to make a sound, other than Pikachu in the intro. Some people were fairly convinced about this, and there was a lot of excitement about that because people had wanted these 2 types for some time now. Since there was a dark type, a light type just made sense, and sound was already a quality that some moves would have, interacting with the soundproof ability similar to how punching, biting, and slashing moves are a thing. So why didn't these types get made, and why did they go with Fairy instead? In this video, I'll explain why, and then I'll use the same logic to make a few new types that could be cool additions to the game. Hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. This is only my second video, and I'm trying to get to the 1,000 subscriber mark as soon as Wait, what? Wow, I mean, I don't think I could ever imagine that first video would land me over 2,000 subscribers. Thank you all so much for interacting with something that I just thought would be kind of fun to do. Every like and subscribe really does help. It's cool to see that number go up, and I've been trying to reply to some of the comments when I can. I guess now let's shoot for 5K. Anyways, let's get into the rest of the video. So first things first, let's get something clear. I don't really think that Pokemon needs a new type. I think the type chart is pretty balanced where it is, and Fairy really kind of set things right for me. However, I just think it's kind of fun to think about what new types could be added to the series, and to find some niches in the Pokédex that have some unrepresented ideas. When it comes to adding a new type into the Pokemon series, I think there are 3 major factors you consider. The first is type identity. Each Pokemon type represents some sort of element, physical attribute, or power that the Pokemon who have it possess. Most of these are pretty distinct, with only a few types like Rock and Ground having a large amount of overlap. A new type added into the series needs to bring something new to the table, or else players are just going to feel like it's an old type with a new paint job. There could be potential to split a type, like changing the flying type into an air and bird type, but that necessitates a huge change to lots and lots of Pokemon, and it leaves some Pokemon like the flying bugs in a weird state of limbo. Overall, we want to make a type that represents something that a lot of Pokemon ideas could have, but not end up making a bunch of Pokemon that feel like they should really have 3 types. Secondly, the type really needs to benefit the game's meta. This could be done by nerfing strong types and buffing weak types, but if we do too much of that, then every type becomes an unwanted medium. Right now, I think Fairy, Water, and Steel are some of the best types in the game, and Bug and Ice are still some of the worst. However, type effectiveness is not the only thing to consider. A lot of types have specific battle properties that make them good in some specific situations, like Poison types absorbing toxic spikes, Ghosts always being able to escape trap moves, and quite a few types interacting with weather. Whatever this new type is could be less significant on the type chart if it allows players to employ some new strategies that shake up the game. Lastly, while I don't think this one is necessary, I think the type should be able to apply to some older Pokemon and moves. This is simply about opportunity cost. If I have the choice of adding in 2 types, but one of them could be applied to a lot more existing Pokemon and make them relevant again, that choice seems clear to me. There's mixed precedent for this, as Steel and Dark didn't really make much of an impact on old content, but Fairy really did. So let's look at the Light type and see how it checks these 3 boxes. Firstly, I think Light's identity would be slightly muddy given other types that exist. If you think about Light physically, it has a lot of overlap with the Electric and Fire types, as both are natural sources of light. A really good example to explain this would be Volbeat and Illumise. It sounds like they would be really good fits for Bug Light types, because they're Fireflies or Lightning Bugs. But if you say that again and slower, you start to see the issue. Chandelure is another really good example. Sure, I think it's definitely supposed to be a fire type, but I mean, it's a chandelier, right? Then this might turn me to think of light more aesthetically. Perhaps the light type is also associated with goodness or innocence. I think that could work well, and it does start to do a little bit of what fairy type ended up doing, but the trouble here is that the fighting type is already associated with honor as a part of its relationship with dark type. where fighting represents honorable fighting tactics, and the dark type represents more underhanded strategies. I do think that overall, Light could have a solid identity if Game Freak was pretty consistent with some Light-specific motifs, like rainbows, prisms, stars, and bioluminescence. Thinking about the type chart though, I think it becomes clear why Fairy was chosen over the Light type. Light could definitely still be super effective against the Dark type, but I don't think it really makes much sense against the Fighting or Dragon type. Light could then also be super effective against Ghosts, as they typically live in darkness. Light could be resisted by the aforementioned Electric and Fire types, but I think it also makes sense to be resisted by Grass. Figuring out Light's weaknesses is a little harder. A lot of people think it would be cool if Light was also weak to Dark, giving it a unique type interaction that hasn't been around since Poison and Bug were super effective against each other in Gen 1. I guess it also makes sense for Grass to be super effective against Light due to photosynthesis, which I think would be an overall good thing since Grass is kind of a less powerful type. Finally, I think Light could resist itself and Electric. Lastly, what existing Pokemon could be made into the Light type? There are a few examples with some weird overlap, like Ampharos, Lantern, the Luxray line, but then there's also a few that might benefit from it. Sunflora, Lumineon, and Watchog with the Illuminate ability would definitely be buffed by gaining the type, and some legendaries like Ho-Oh and Cresselia would also fit the bill. Cherrim might also be an interesting pick, as its whole thing is about blooming to receive the light. In a post-Gen 5, post-Fairy world, some other obvious picks would be the Cosmog line and both of its legendary evolutions, as well as Tadbulb and Bellibolt. Overall, the Light type seems to kind of hit all three factors, but we'll compare its performance to Fairies later on. Next, let's look at the Sound type. Sound already has a bit of an identity in the game, as sound itself is already an attribute that some Pokemon moves can have, which can be blocked by the ability Soundproof. Sound could also encapsulate the concept of music, which is totally distinct from all other types in the chart. Skipping ahead to applying this type to old Pokemon and moves, I think it becomes pretty simple. For moves, I think we could change any of the normal type sound moves that are attacking, and then for the status moves, it doesn't really matter what type they are. The best picks for sound Pokemon include the Jigglypuff and Exploud lines, Snorlax, Kricketune, Chingling and Chimecho, Chatot, Audino, Baractus, and Mayoletta. Post-Gen 5, I think you could also add in Pyroar, the Noivern line, Rillaboom, and maybe Screamtail. However, where I think the sound type struggles is type effectiveness. I think a lot of the reason that sound-based moves are normal type is because it's not very clear what they should be strong against. I think the most natural real-world association I can think of is sound shattering glass, but glass isn't exactly covered in the type chart. Maybe it is with ground, but that feels like a really niche reason to be strong against the whole type. Perhaps sound could be good against water, since water conducts sound very well, but then on the other hand, maybe water should be good against sound, since it can kind of drown it out. Overall, I just don't think it's very clear what this type should be good at. It seems to me like it should just be something that's neutral against most types, but that's what normal already is. So I think normal already holds this spot. So overall, I think the sound type seems promising at first, but when it comes to the type chart, it becomes clear why it's relegated to just being a move attribute. So, as we've seen, a new type needs to benefit the type chart and in-game meta, remain distinct mechanically and aesthetically, and it's a big bonus if it can be applied to a bunch of old content. I think Light and Sound really only hit one or two of these on the head, and then maybe kind of work on another, but they both miss out on affecting the type chart significantly. However, Fairy fits all of these dead on. First off, Fairy has a pretty distinct identity to me. It definitely is kind of the cutesy Pokemon type, but it also has some connotations of being otherworldly or strange. You see a lot of motifs like big, puffy, or round Pokemon for Fairy type, and pink is definitely a color to look out for. As far as the type chart goes, I think Fairy knocked it out of the park on this one. Its weaknesses make total sense as Poison and Steel both represent the decay and destruction of the natural world, where fairies live, as well as legends saying that fairies were weak to a substance called cold iron. For its offensive advantages, I think it makes sense that the Fairy type is able to defeat some of the big bad offensive types in the game, being Dragon, Fighting, and Dark. I've always thought its immunity to Dragon is maybe an overstep, but I think its resistances and its offensive disadvantages make a lot of sense to me. And then finally, lots of old Pokemon were able to be reanimated when given this type. Pokemon like Marill were definitely not at the front of my mind, but with the Fairy type now, they seem a lot more relevant. So, what are some other types that could work on these levels, given the current state of Pokemon in 2025? A great place to start when thinking of new types is thinking about types that might nerf the Fairy type. Currently, it's only weak to Poison and Steel, and as I said before, both those weaknesses make a lot of sense. To me, this kind of says that fairies are weak to the types of the modern age, and a commonly brought up fan type that fits this bill would definitely be the digital type. The digital type could be really made to be about software, glitches, and viruses, keeping electric to be about power and steel to be about metal. However, when we think about what Pokemon would be good for that type, I think the Porygon line and maybe Genesect are the only really good fits. Rotom could also be in this digital type, but I actually think that electric still fits the bill better here. Rotom's base form is electric ghost type, and I think the ghost is important here because it helps us understand that Rotom is kind of haunting these various appliance forms. I think the electric type fits here better because all of those devices need power, but not all of them need software. Sure, maybe a washing machine or a smart refrigerator would have some software, but a lawnmower or a fan? And in 2008? I don't think so. This problem of identity stretches forward a bit, where future Pokemon of this type would have to move a little too far into sci-fi and robots than the series is really used to. Pokemon is a game that's primarily about creatures after all, your pets. So, thinking about this like the devs did in Gen 6, is there maybe a way we could pivot this type to have a bit of a twist that fits better for the series? I think the answer here is to instead call it the Techno type. It's a very subtle difference, but this steers us away from having the type be purely about software. Techno conveys that the Pokemon of this type are perhaps mechanical in nature, man-made, or resemble automatons. I think this still makes sense for Porygon, since it is a man-made computer program, and it definitely still makes sense for Genesect, since it's not just a steel bug like Durant, but a robot bug made by people. And I think it could even apply to some other mechanical Pokemon, like the Klinklang line and the automaton Pokemon Golett and Golurk. I think Techno overlaps less with Electric than Digital does, and the division between Techno and Steel is actually greater than you think it might be. Steel would remain as the type that represents physically, naturally occurring metal. Think about the difference between Genesect and Durant again. Looking at all the Steel-type Pokemon in existence, there's actually only a very small set of them that are based on machines. These Pokemon, in my mind, are the Klinklang line, Magearna, the Revavroom line, maybe the Magnemite line, and Iron Treads. I do think I stand by Rotom staying as an electric type, but we could give it a new Techno-type form by having it possess a computer, a phone, or maybe a drone like it does in the anime. The only other non-Steel type Pokemon who could be Techno-type are Xurkitree, some of the other Paradox Pokemon, and Voltorb and Electrode. For those last two, I think that would actually be a pretty cool way to add some symmetry between them and their Hisuian forms, which are currently electric and grass types. But now, of course, we'll have to talk about how this type would interact with the type chart. As we said before, this type could serve as another weakness for the fairy type, since technology represents the future and our current, less mystical present. Additionally, I think Techno could be good against Electric, which currently only has one weakness of ground. Electric is weak to ground because of the concept of electrical grounding, where all the electricity is dissipated into the ground. So likewise, we could think of the Techno-type as absorbing all of that electricity for its own power. I think the types that could resist Techno-type would be Ghost and Poison. For defenses, I think the Techno-type would first need to be weak to water. I know I said that water is one of the best types earlier, but I do think that's more due to its weaknesses only to grass and electric, and the fact that it can hit most types for at least neutral damage. I think it makes sense for water to be good against Techno, as it could rust or short circuit these guys. Another type that would be funny to see as super effective against the Techno type would be the Bug type. I know this is really more of a pun, but that's actually how the term computer bug was popularized. A literal bug was in the machinery and was causing a malfunction. Besides, this would be a really welcome addition to the Bug type, as it's probably the worst type in the series right now. Making it super effective against the new Techno type would be similar to how Poison was elevated due to being good against Fairy. Finally, I think the Techno type would resist itself, Steel, Electric, and Poison, making the two types resist each other just like how Bug and Fighting do. I don't think it should be immune to Poison, as Techno doesn't necessarily mean metal, as shown by including the Voltorb and Golett lines. For an interesting battle property we could give the Techno type, I think it would be cool if we give it immunity to the sleep condition unless it uses the move Rest, as a lot of machines have some sort of rest or sleep mode to conserve power. This works really well, as right now all the other status conditions have at least one type immune to them at least most of the time. Fire for burn, Electric for paralyzed, Poison and Steel for poisoned, and Ice for frozen. I think a Techno form of Eevee would also be really cool, and you could even employ a cool evolution method that maybe has to do with depositing and withdrawing it from the PC while it's holding a certain item. With all that, I think the Techno type could be a pretty cool addition to the main series. Another really commonly requested type is the Cosmic or Space type. There are a lot of Pokemon that have to do with outer space, and currently, the space concepts are spread across the Flying, Fairy, Psychic, and Steel types, so it definitely feels like it's unrepresented territory. However, when thinking about its type advantages and disadvantages, I thought up an interesting idea that might pivot this type to be about more than just beings from outer space. In Greek philosophy, there are 4 basic or classical elements: air, water, earth, and fire. Many other cultures have these concepts of classical elements, some only slightly differing, but the Greek philosopher Aristotle added a 5th element that I think could be the name for this type: aether. Aether was perceived as a celestial element that was unchangeable in nature, since the stars and planets were considered to be the only truly consistent thing back then. And it was also considered to be what the stars, planets, and space itself were made out of. However, there were also some more mystical connotations to aether, as it was personified as one of the Greek primordial gods. I think this would give it an identity that's not just the space type, but more so a celestial one. Some great examples would be the 4 genies to be Flying Aether, Electric Aether, Ground Aether, and Fairy Aether, as well as making Arceus a pure Aether type. For the types that Aether could be strong against, I think it'd be really cool if it were just strong against the other 4 classical elements: Fire, Water, Flying for Air, and Ground for Earth, because Rock really doesn't need any more weaknesses. Types that resist Aether could be Aether itself, Psychic, and Dark, since the Greek god Aether was said to be born from Erebus and Nyx, the primordial gods of darkness and night. Defensively, I think Psychic and Dark could be strong against it for the same reasons, and perhaps Dragon could be strong against it. Dragon was obviously nerfed in Gen 6 due to the Fairy type coming out, but honestly since then, I feel like it's fallen down a bit, so it'd be cool to give Dragon a second type advantage. It also just seems fitting for celestial beings to be beaten by dragons, which are mythical beings. Types that would not be very effective against Aether could be the 4 classical elements, and maybe also Rock and Ice, which are common things you can find out in space. The Aether type could have the interesting battle property of blocking its opponents from using weather-creating moves, sort of asserting its dominance over the skies. Not too different than the Airlock or Cloud9 abilities. Additionally, Aether-type Pokemon that set up weather could set it up for 8 turns instead of 5, basically acting as a free damp, heat, smooth, or icy rock. For Pokemon that might fit the bill for this type, I'll go with the Clefairy line as Fairy Aether types, perhaps the Starmie line as Water Aether types, Solrock, Lunatone, and Minior as Rock Aether types, the Gothita line as Psychic Aether, Algium, Beheeyem, Deoxys, and Cresselia as Pure Aether, Palkia as Dragon Aether, and the Cosmog line, including both of its legendary evolutions, as Pure Aether, Steel Aether, and Ghost Aether, respectively. Don't think I would forget about Castform though. I would just add Aether to all of its types, including the normal one. Overall, I think that makes Aether a pretty cool type that would be really fun to play around. Finally, I wanted to make a type that a lot of people suggest online, but no one seems to know exactly how to do it. The idea starts off with what would be the food type. There are a ton of food-based Pokemon in the series already, often being associated with the Fairy or Grass types, but not only being associated with them, as seen by the Vanillux line. It's pretty easy to extract the food-based Fairy types, but the trouble really comes in drawing a line between the food and grass types. Maybe Applin and Cherubi are obviously foods, but what about Maractus, since Cactus is totally edible? Or the many fungus-based Pokemon, the Smoliv line, or Execute, which, come to think of it, why is that even a grass type? As you can see, things start to get muddy pretty quickly. When thinking about how to balance this, I had the thought to draw a line in the sand between cooked and raw food, but I was unsure what I would call that. And then, does Milcery really fit that? What about Fido, since it's still raw? Finally, I think I came to a conclusion. We'll call this type the Sugar type. Looking back at what Pokemon should be in this type, I'll definitely still stick with all 3 of the Fairy type Pokemon I mentioned earlier. For grass types, I'll only take a few. I'll take not the whole Applin line, but only Diplin and Hydrapple, making them Sugar Dragon type Pokemon. This adds a little bit of extra flair to the new evolution, and makes perfect sense as you evolve Applin into Diplin by giving it the Syrupy Apple. Finally, we'll want to make the Vanillux line an Ice Sugar type, and you could potentially also take the Sinistea line and make them Ghost Sugar type. A new Sugar type evolution might also be cool, especially as a foil to Sylveon, which is the only evolution to come out by itself in Gen 6. Now, this all sounds great, but how does it interact on the type chart? I do think it makes a lot of sense for both the Poison and Bug type to be super effective against Sugar, as both of these types could rot whatever food the sugar was in. This is great because Poison and Bug are both pretty weak types. However, this means that if sugar was paired with grass, it would have two 4x weaknesses. This isn't unheard of, but I think we would just want to steer clear of adding the sugar type to any existing grass monotype Pokemon, which I consider doing for the Bounsweet line. Offensively, I think sugar could be super effective against steel, as sugar can actually corrode away metal pipes. Sugar could be super effective against grass for similar reasons, but I don't think grass really needs any more weaknesses. So instead, we could also just maybe make sugar strong against the fighting type, as an unhealthy diet would make fighting Pokemon weaker. Finally, I think that the water, bug, poison, and ghost types could resist sugar. I think the sugar type could then resist steel, fighting, and grass. But the most interesting thoughts I had about the sugar type were its battle properties. The first idea I had would be to give the sugar type an associated status condition, like burn, paralysis, or freeze. We'll call this status effect stomachache, as if the afflicted Pokemon just ate too much sugar. Primarily, the stomachache effect will keep the Pokemon from eating any berries or using leftovers, as well as adding recoil damage to every attacking move the Pokemon uses, stacking with any existing recoil. The sugar type could be immune to this status effect. Some different properties for the stomachache effect could be to have the special attack of the afflicted Pokemon. This makes a lot of sense because right now, Burn can have the physical attack of a Pokemon, but there's nothing that has the special attack of a Pokemon. Lastly, when thinking about sugar as a type, I kept coming back to the idea of salt being a substance that can ward off ghosts and fairies in mythology. So I think it'd be cool to give it a sugar type move called Salty Sweet, which could be a high power special move that's also super effective on ghosts and or fairy types, similar to how Freeze Dry is super effective against water types. Giving the sugar type the combination of the type chart I proposed, the stomachache effect, and the move Salty Sweet would probably make it come in as a bit of an overpowered type. So I think the best answer here is to maybe pick a combination of the three to create a well-balanced new entry into the type chart. So that's it! 3 new types, being Techno, Aether, and Sugar. Out of all of these, I think Aether is my favorite, and I think it's the most likely to be added to the Pokemon series, at least in some way or another. Comment down below what types you would like to see added to Pokemon, and then check out my other video where I made 8 dual-type gym leaders. I'll see y'all in the next video.